Everyone. Just want to make some comments about this reading from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which is from the 13th century, part of a much longer work, of course. The Summa Theologica, the summation of all things having to do with theology, I suppose. This is just one small part of it, talking about different kinds of law. I'm giving this to you as a kind of a typical medieval way of thinking, which is very, very influential, and in certain ways, it's kind of like what modern political and legal theories are responding to or diverging from or protesting against this typical medieval view of things. I think the trick in this reading is to understand essentially what he's getting at by the different types of law, especially eternal law, natural law, and human law, and then to see how they all fit together. This is a theological view, a view that is based upon belief in God and belief that everything that we see, everything that appears to us in nature, physical nature, and in terms of how nature works, and everything that appears in living nature, in terms of animals, and everything that appears in us as rational animals or rational creatures, has to be seen as a reflection of God's will in some respect. Some respect. It's a different way of looking at things. And so our notion of law, of what is right and wrong, of what is just and unjust, is ultimately rooted in God for a thinker like Thomas Aquinas. So that eternal law is really God's law, what God decrees for the universe. And that for Thomas included the laws of nature, what physics studies, for instance. So that the laws of nature, if we were to discover them, which presumably have, is the discovery of God's way of dictating how nature works, physical nature. But then there are moral laws, and those we discover in ourselves. And for Thomas, they're ultimately based upon God's will, God's intention, and that is both eternal law and divine law. But eternal law, what does he say it is? It's always good to look for the I answer that. I know this is a certain way of going about things, this dialectical method of medieval schoolmen. Objections, responses to objections, citing authority, but usually the really interesting part is in the I answer that, where he basically states his own opinion. Whether there is an eternal law, like an eternal law about right and wrong, about just and unjust, about the way the world should go. He says, stated above, a law is nothing else but a dictate of practical reason. A dictate of practical reason, something that is, a principle or a precept that people should follow in their practical reason about what to do. Right? A dictate of practical reason emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community. Now, it is evident, granted that the world is ruled by divine providence. That is, granted that we live in a created world, a world that's created by God, and in which God is working out his intentions. That's what providence is. That the whole community of the universe is governed by divine reason. Wherefore, the very idea of the government of things in God, the ruler of the universe, has the nature of a law. Imagining God, the creator of the universe, as not only its creator, but its ruler. And since the divine reason's conception of things is not subject to time, but is eternal, according to Proverbs 8:23, therefore it is that this kind of law must be called eternal. So, idea is that if God has decreed something for his creation that is an eternal law, it's not something that is in time. It is eternal like God. So let's just say that there is an eternal law, and it's the foundation of everything in terms of how the world should go. What is natural law? Again, skipping to the I answer that, he says, as stated above, law, being a rule and measure, can be in a person in two ways. In one way, as in him that rules and measures, in another way, as in that which is ruled and measured. It reminds you of that ruling and being ruled. Since a thing is ruled and measured insofar as it partakes of the rule and measure, the suggestion being that we are ruled and measured by eternal law. Wherefore, since all things subject to divine providence are ruled and measured by the eternal law, as was stated above, it is evident that all things partake somewhat of the eternal law. That is, we participate in the eternal law. But since the eternal law is God's mind, therefore, and infinite, right, our finitude, our limits would not be able to totally comprehend it. It is evident that all things partake somewhat of the eternal law, insofar as, namely, from its being imprinted on them. That is, we are imprinted, our minds, our soul bears the imprint of the eternal law. They derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. But we are in some way directed about how to live by the eternal law. Now, among all others, the rational creature is subject, and that's us, the rational creature, subject to divine providence in the most excellent way, insofar as it partakes of a share of providence by being provident both for itself and others. That is, we have the capacity not only to be ruled by law, but to reason. That is, that's what he means by being provident both for itself and others. We are not only ruled by divine reason, we have the capacity of reason ourselves. Wherefore, it has a share of the eternal reason, whereby it has a natural inclination to its proper act and end. And this participation of the eternal law in the rational creature is called the natural law. So the natural law is reason. The natural law is our capacity, limited though it may be, to distinguish between good and evil. Hence the psalmist, after saying, offer up the sacrifice of justice, as though someone asked what the works of justice are, added, many say, who showeth us good things? In answer to which question he says, the light of thy countenance, O Lord, is signed upon us. Right? In some way or another, God's light is signed upon us, is imprinted on us, thus implying that the light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is the function of the natural law, that is, our capacity to recognize fundamentally good and evil, is nothing else than the imprint on us of the divine light. It is therefore evident that the natural law is nothing else than the rational creature's participation of or participation in the eternal law. So, again, the notion of God in traditional Western theology is that God is infinite and perfect, and that human beings are finite and imperfect. So we could never fully comprehend the eternal law. But to the extent that we can, that is our grasp of natural law, which includes fundamentally our capacity to recognize good and evil, justice and injustice, decent and indecent. So natural law is built upon eternal law. And then there is this third level, the human law. What is the human law? It might be a little bit difficult to get through this. Let's look again at the I answer that. As stated above, right here, a law is a dictate of the practical reason. Now it is to be observed. Geez, what did I do here? Mess that up. Let's get back to human law. Now it is to be observed that the same procedure takes place in the practical and in the speculative reason, for each proceeds from principles to conclusions. That is, we start from very general principles in both, we'll say, mathematics and in moral reasoning. And then we reason from those general principles to particular conclusions having to do with particular situations. Accordingly, we conclude that just as in the speculative reason, from naturally known indemonstrable principles, we draw the conclusions of the various sciences, the knowledge of which is not imparted to us by nature, but acquired by the efforts of reason, so too it is from the precepts of the natural law The basic principles of what is just, decent, and right that we know naturally, as from general and indemonstrable principles, that the human reason needs to proceed to the more particular determination of certain matters. That's the key, right? Let's just say that we know from the natural law that life is a good, which is one of the basic principles of Thomas Aquinas's morality. Life is a good. Human life is a good, and should be protected. That is a basic principle that we accept. What about killing in war? What about the death penalty? What about abortion? What about all those situations in which we do kill? Can they be defended? Right? What is the morality of them? That's an example of going from a particular principle to from a general principle to a particular situation. So human law is really applying the general principles of natural law to particular situations. Let's saying that there should be a death penalty, maybe for certain horrible crimes, or the human laws of war that say that soldiers are not murderers when they kill other soldiers on the battlefield during a battle, or that soldiers are murderers if they kill civilians. Something like that would be a particular determination of the general principle. Lastly, there's divine law. And the question is whether there's any need for divine law. Divine law is revelation. Divine law is what you find in books that are called scriptural, the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, in which God gives particular directives. And the idea here is that over and above our rational capacity to recognize good and evil and to apply the general principles to particular situations, we need further guidance. As he says, on account of the uncertainty of human judgment, especially on contingent and particular matters, different people form different judgments on human acts, whence also different and contrary laws result. In order, therefore, that man may know without any doubt what he ought to do and what he ought to avoid, it was necessary for man to be directed in his proper acts by a law given by God. For it is certain that such a law cannot err. That is, something like, the Sabbath day, keep it holy. That is not something that people would arrive at through pure reason. That's a law that God gave the Israelites because they needed to know it. But they would have never arrived at it through their grasp of natural law. Right? So, over and above our rational capacity to understand good and evil, general principles, and then apply them properly to particular situations, Thomas Aquinas says we need further, in some cases, further and more particular instruction, and that would be divine law.